to come in. So yeah, meeting next Monday at 1 in the PM. Also, we will again finals are due next Thursday at 11:59 p.m. as well as any late assignments. Your quizzes should be open for you guys to take. If you guys are needing to take those, do take your quizzes. I know quiz number 6 just passed a little while ago, so if you guys need to take those or retake those for a better score, that's one of the same. That's one of the ways in which to boost your score. Will it be the same Zoom link for next Monday? Yes. Yes, it'll be just we'll move it up to 1 o'clock. And so, and I'll be sure to resend that out to you guys if you guys are needing that. Um, but yeah, that's all I can kind of think of for this week's kind of announcements, updates. Again, late work still being accepted. If there was a few emails that came in, if you guys are working in groups, yes, work in groups. You don't have to. But if you choose to do so, just send me an email with the names of the group members. And on your projects, whether it's video, PowerPoint, whatever you guys do, just let me know somewhere that you're working with your group members. And each group member needs to turn in a project. I know it sounds redundant and it sounds like it's just overdoing it, but there's been more than one occasion where one person turns in their assignment and then yeah, it just makes it a mess, and then I end up having to go back and forth and bouncing back and forth because different people from different classes, yeah. And so again, each individual member will turn in a project. Again, even if you're working in groups, it's the same exact project. Just again, submit it for your own name and for your own sake, so I know and I can put in a grade. And it just makes it easier for you to get a more to see your grade more quickly and more immediately. If you're wondering about your grade, they are as up to date. I think the only assignment that's missing is the scripture as story, the last one that we did. The Psalm devotional should be updated in there. I think that's the last one I got through. So again, the grades are as up to date as possible. I'll be going through late assignments this week. So if you've had a bunch that you turned in, take a look Thursday, Friday at the latest, and you should see an update if you had a bunch of late assignments turned in. Yeah, other than that, are there any other questions? Adriana, you've got an awesome tree in the background. Me and my wife, we've yet to put up our Christmas tree yet. It's just, yeah, too much stuff going down to worry about a Christmas tree right now. So, anybody? Any questions, comments, concerns? Put it up November 1st. It was still like 98 degrees outside when the Christmas tree went up. All right. All right. So let's go ahead and go through it. You guys will notice on Moodle week 15, the PowerPoint is already up there, but I will be jumping around a little bit again. We won't be doing a break today because class should be over by that time. At least that's my hope. And so what we're going to be going through today, I had said we're going to go through John and Revelation, but again, because of some time things and some of the issues that just recently came up, what I do want to bring up, one of the things is, again, we'll go through the Acts of the Bible. And I'll go through this again. Part of it is to kind of restate what we've already kind of gone through. But we've talked through the acts acts of the Bible. In Act 1, where God establishes his kingdom with creation, and we saw this with Genesis 1 and 2. And if you guys haven't started on your storyboard project, or if you guys are needing some clarification for some things, this will provide your clarification as well as hopefully provide you with a kickstart. So God is establishing his kingdom with creation, Genesis 1 and 2. Then we have in Act 2, rebellion in the kingdom, where fall or sin enters the world. And this is Genesis 3 all the way through to about 11. Again, it's most focused around Genesis 3 and the situation that happens there between Adam and Eve and the serpent. And we see the consequences start to trickle down in chapter 4 and especially in chapter 6, where we have Cain and Abel. We see the rupturing of families. And then in Genesis chapter 6, we see what happens with the flood and the kind of global spread of what's happening in Genesis chapter 3. And so then we jump over to Act 3, and that really goes from Genesis. There we go. I keep putting Genesis 12 all the way through to Malachi, otherwise known as Malachi. And so there's a lot of ground to cover here. There was a few questions that had come up here, more specifically about what needs to be covered and what should be included. Use your scripture as story assignments as a guide. So you're going to want to include some Abraham. You're going to want to include some Moses in the Exodus. It'd probably be a really good idea to include Samuel and Hannah. Yeah, Malachi. Yeah, one of my friends, when in undergrad, she was from Israel. She spoke Hebrew, but kept calling him Malachi. We had no idea what was going on there, but you'll want to include Solomon and the monarchy. Divided kingdom would be a good thing to include. And so you guys kind of get the idea, and you guys are definitely going to want to include exile. Because again, that exile it stains Hebrew imagination so radically that it's something you're going to want to include as a part of the story. Then obviously we made brief mention of what's happening here. Interlude, again, this doesn't necessarily need to be included. Brownie points if you do so, extra credit points if you do so, kind of include a little bit of a sliver. We talked through some of the Maccabees and some of the different revolts that happened during this time period. What's happening with the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Persians, the Greeks, and then the Romans. But then Act 4, and this is going to be the Gospels, the coming of the King, redemption accomplished. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And the spreading the news of the King. And this is going to happen from Acts all the way through to Jude. And then Act 6, which we'll talk about in brief today, that's pretty much just going to be Revelation. And so again, so you guys have this on recording. If you guys need to take a screenshot, there it is. There you go. Take a screenshot, take a picture, draw it, write it down, do whatever you got to do. Again, these are going to be what you want to include on your storyboard project. So I know that you know that we know what you're all talking about when you're making reference to specific stories in the Bible. And again, you're going to be telling the story, which this is a part. Also, as you can see, your boy's been stepping up his PowerPoint game. So, redemptive ending. So with Revelation, there's a few things I need to bring up as we kind of wrap up the story of the Bible. Part of it is the background, but the big thing that I want to bring up with John's letter in Revelation. We had been talking about last week about how these letters are being written to Jewish Christians that are suffering persecution, and John's Revelation is no different. That John is continuing to write to communities that are experiencing suffering, except they're more specific: Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. And these 7 churches represent the entire church that's representative of the kingdom of God, or God's people as a part of the church. And I'm going to be going through this a little bit quickly, mostly because I want to focus on the last part. If you guys want to go through these kind of definitions again, feel free to come back to them. But one of the issues, most specifically in Revelation, is the language. But because Revelation itself is 2 things. It's prophetic literature, which uses a lot of symbolism. That's why you see beasts, dragons, harlots, references to Babylon, even though it had already fallen by that point. You see kind of floating lanterns. You see floating flames. And that prophetic and apocalyptic literature has that tendency, that it's a genre in the ancient world that, again, relies heavily on imagery. And so again, when you're relying a lot on contemporary kind of references, that if you can kind of think, what are some of the kind of figures of speech that we use today? Think of some of the figure of speech that we use today. What would be a kind of figure of speech that we use?
If you say something is like cool, but it's not actually cold.
Exactly. So we don't mean temperature wise. Like what we mean is like um it's I don't even know what, like I don't want to say favorable, but it there's a positive disposition towards the thing in which it's being called cool. That we like it. We really enjoy it. It's again beneficial. It's raining cats and dogs, definitely. Definitely. This puppy weighs a ton. And the only reason I know that is because so our puppy, you guys have been there since the beginning. Homegirl, we got her at 13 pounds. She's now like 36. 2 months later, she gained, geez, 20-ish pounds. But again, you say, oh, and she weighs a ton. And so again, these kinds of figures of speech that we use that are familiar for us that may not be so familiar for people in differing contexts. And you guys, any of you that speak another language, whether it be Chinese, Arabic, Spanish, Portuguese, French, Urdu, whatever it might be, there's certain phrases in Spanish that don't translate over to English, and certain phrases in English that don't translate over to Spanish. Um, like one of the things I was talking with my wife is like when somebody's throwing shade. What we mean is that it's not literally somebody's like putting an umbrella over somebody else's head. And if you were to translate to Spanish, it just doesn't. It's not the same. Tira la sombra. Like it that doesn't make sense in Spanish. Like the idiom is it's not the same, and so that's part of the problem that what we have in Revelation is that the references that are used in Revelation, we're listening to a conversation happening between contemporaries, and you know that when you've got your girls or your boys, and you guys just have language that you guys are savvy to, you guys have inside jokes that you're savvy to. Then if anybody else were listening on the conversation, they get lost. And so again, like watching a show at the midpoint and trying to figure out all the through lines, like unless we have an understanding of these images and the language, then it's going to be really very difficult. Because the other issue is the fact that Revelation is a letter. It's a letter being written to a church. Churches. And so you see references again, four corners of the earth, meaning every part of the globe appeared as. That's why John, a lot of times, and you'll see this in different parts of the Bible, appeared as a lion with a human body. It's like that episode. Everything I always got references for the episode of The Office. But do you guys remember? For those of you that are Office fans, if you're not, I apologize. Just entertain me for a minute. Um, where there's a curse on the office, and Michael tries to figure out who done it, and they try to figure out who to offer a sacrifice to. It's like an egret's head with the raccoon body with deer antlers. Like I don't remember the exact phrase, but he's trying to figure out like which deity it is, and he just kind of puts all these different animals together to try to make it seem like okay, this is some kind of god that we can pray to. And again, it's a lot like that. Like John is having a hard time trying to describe what he's seen, so he can only say it looks like this. It appeared like this. It looked like Jesus' feet were like burnished bronze. His eyes were like fire. And so again, that this kind of imagery of which language is only so because only do so much work because of its limitations poses another problem for us. And so one of the solutions in reading through Revelation is first identifying the context and meaning for the original audience, which is always our goal. And then understanding literary devices. Again, that's what happens when we're reading a story well, that we become informed about the language that is being used by the original audience. And we've already been talking about in the semester, and you guys are taking classes in BLE and in cultures that are helping you to understand the language of the original audience in order to rightly understand the story of redemption that God is working out and that God has written both to his people then and to his people now in order to help make us a more faithful people. And this is what makes language so important. So important. Because again, most of the time when we're having conversation with people, we only get one shot at things. And then we have to pay attention to the kind of language that we use. And I'm not saying like, hey, stop cussing. My concern isn't about cussing as much as it is with the clarity of communication, that we both understand what we're reading and we understand what we're saying, and we understand the weight of what we're saying. And so that being said, with Revelation, there's two big themes that come through with John's last words. And one of them is to be ready. And especially right now, this message resounds with a lot of what's happening in a lot of churches, sometimes by way of kind of like paranoid superstition slash conspiracy theory in the name of end time kind of pandemonium. Like, because all these things are happening, like the end is coming, the world's coming to an end now. Donate now because the world's about to come to an end, and you can secure your place in heaven if you just the world's been ending for the past 2,000 years. And so again, Jesus inaugurated this kind of beginning of the end, but John's last words and this be ready more so has to do with the maintenance of issues within the Christian community in order for the church to be strengthened to persevere through suffering, which is about to take place soon. So again, John's encouragement comes to the community much in the same way that the letters written by James, by Peter, by Jude, by John to say, hey, take care of these issues that are happening in your churches, in your communities, because suffering is coming. And in order to endure these things, not to bypass them, not to try to make them not happen, not to try to soften their blow. But if you guys are going to make it through these things, and you guys are going to have to tend to these issues which are present in your guys' communities. And so the issues range from theological and doctrinal concerns about getting things right, getting their theology right, they're thinking about Jesus right, to the testing of their works to be sure that they got their priorities straight. And then a kind of repentance from half-hearted faithfulness, which we've talked about before, that the meaning of having faith has much less to do with a kind of cognitive belief about what you know, and more so about a full-hearted loyalty, devotion to Jesus, even at the expense of one's own life. Again, so it should not come to us as a surprise when we're reading through John, when we see these mentions and these encouragements from John about, hey, make sure that you guys are loyal and devoted to Jesus as you guys are continuing to walk this thing out, even in the face of suffering. Because again, that taking care of the issues would not keep them from experiencing suffering and persecution, but rather it's going to be the thing that helps them to endure it. That these communities are helping people to not just cope with the situation, but to be able to endure in the midst of it. And if there's anything more hellish on earth, I've yet to know it, but than to suffer alone and to suffer isolated. And I would say that's probably as close to hell as we can get. Again, it's not theological, it's just more observational and experiential. And so it makes sense in places where Paul's saying to bear one another's burdens, and in doing this, you're fulfilling the law. And to allow yourself, and I know we're all going through a lot right now, and the last thing we want to do is to try to experience the weight of what somebody else is going through, especially as we're going through so much ourselves. And as somebody who gets it wrong often, I'm right there with you guys about if there's second thoughts about how much more can we actually take on with already so much going on. Again, I want to encourage you guys that if check up on your friends to make sure they're okay, and to find, even if it's just a friend or two, to be open with and to be honest with, that if you're struggling with something, talk about it. Talk about it, because again, it's hellish. It's brutal to have to suffer alone. And then to have help so near and what God's provided in the community of people around you, even if it's scary as crap to be able to talk about the things that you're wrestling with. And that's why I say find a group of people you can trust and you feel that that they're safe people, in order that you might be able to experience the grace and the love of Jesus that he's invested into people that are trying to take serious what he talks about with extending grace towards one another and about loving people. And so, as somebody who's struggled a whole bunch of stuff, that there's very few things that are more healing than experiencing the grace and the love of Jesus in the love and the grace of the community that he's provided around you. And so again, the issues that persist, it comes back to the fact that it's it comes back to maintaining community. And it's hard. It's hard. But again, as pandemic has let us know, relationships take work. But it's one of the works that are it's work that's worth it. Work that is worth it. And so one of the last things John also leaves with us is that God is in control. That though holy war is a major image in Revelation, again, this kind of battle between God and the powers, that God ultimately triumphs over the powers of darkness, the powers of evil, the powers of injustice, the powers of cruelty. That God ultimately triumphs over these things, and that those who inflict suffering will be judged by the coming and conquering King. That there's a blessing, and God's blessing is for those who hear and hold on to, or hear and obey the words of the vision, which essentially, again, it goes back to being faithful, to trusting in the face of uncertain, difficult, and trying circumstances, of which we find ourselves now. So just goes to show you how little times have changed. And this talking about these kinds of things sounded a lot different a few years ago, when there just wasn't a lot going on, if we didn't at least alert ourselves to them, because there's always a war going on somewhere, there's always cruelty going on somewhere, but it's often that I'm the one that's having to bring these kinds of things up. Again, the situation that's ongoing in Armenia, ongoing in Yemen, ongoing in Ethiopia, ongoing in Venezuela, unrest in so many different places that is causing suffering, and people that are needing a God who is both judge and coming king, in order to vindicate those who suffer. And again, it's the reality for a lot of us here. And so this was supposed to be the time for a break, but like good soldiers, we'll march on, because won't be done by the time break should have happened. But one of the last things we do want to talk about in this class is about redemption. You guys will have gone through this for your scripture as story assignment, but a few things with redemption. And finally, we're talking about it. I had mentioned at the start of class that the big theme that was guiding our class was redemption. And one of the things that I talked about up front is that we'll talk about it at the end of class. And one of the reasons why I want to bring it up is that at the end of class is because you guys not only know so much more, but I would dare to say you guys are more adept at making the connections, at seeing within the story in which God provides redemption for his people. There's a few quotes here from Sandra Richter, um, that our objective as Christians is to understand the story of redemption in the Bible. And I had made mention of this at the start of class, but that in reading the Bible again, we're not just reading God's love letter to us, though it includes portions and elements of that. We're not just reading basic instructions before leaving Earth, which I was taught that. We're reading the story that includes the messy tragedies um, of family relationships, that it includes tragic injustice like women being tossed out of homes as single mothers, like what happens to Hagar, stories about rape and incest, stories about murder, and also stories about how God rescues his people from injustice and cruelty, and ultimately how God gives of himself for humanity in order to redeem them, to restore them, to bring them back to himself. And so again, that we can no better capture this story than by the description of the Bible as a story of redemption. But Richter writes that in order for us to understand the content, we need to understand the culture in which is communicated. So it's going to be a little bit of a different of a detour here. That if you guys take a look at this art here, that we have to know that the way stories are told always come to us within a context. And that the best stories are not just born from a context, but also speak to their context. And again, the best stories don't just emerge from a context, but also speak to their context. Again, that's what made stories like what emerged from like the timing of the Black Panther. That it's not just the context in which it was created, because the story came years back, but how Marvel again resurrected the story, the storyline of Black Panther, the time in which it emerged when there's a lot of injustice going on in America. And so how again this story comes up in this telling of the story in which it again it addresses the context in which it's happening. But one of the ways redemption has been told, and more specifically in Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, again, these kind of cultural depictions of Jesus, that you have this in it's in France, this Eisenheim altarpiece, and you'll see here it's much bigger, but for the sake kind of the art of it, you'll see here John the Baptist again. All these cultural depictions right here. It's in France, so you'll see everybody's that's just French looking. Um, you'll see here John the Baptist as his finger as he's pointing towards Mary. You see John the disciple here and Mary here who's kind of taken aback. You see again another Mary who's here. Then you see Jesus. But if you were to take a closer look, you would see that Jesus's body is experiencing not just crucifixion, but also the Black Plague. Because at the time, you have the Black Plague that's sweeping through Europe. And that what's being depicted isn't just Jesus suffering generally, but more specifically, that Jesus is suffering the plague alongside those that are experiencing suffering themselves. That Jesus takes the weight of what's happening and takes it upon himself. And so again, as Jesus is laid into his tomb, that Jesus is a victim, not just of crucifixion, but of the plague itself. So that those who would have succumbed to this Black Plague to death don't just go to die alone, but that Jesus experiences the pains of death with them. And it'd be fair to say that if you have Jesus likewise experiencing COVID-19, and that those who experience death don't die alone, but that even in death, God is with them as they experience what's happening to them. That God is even in solidarity with those who die by way of plague, by virus, by injustice. And that again, that God has provided redemption through the cross of Jesus for those who have died. and then the promise of resurrection, redemption for those who have died in Christ. And so again, but you see this representation, how it's coming from a culture and speaking likewise to its culture, which we'll see again here. You have this cultural depiction of Jesus, and you have in a Catholic cathedral over in Kenya, again, this depiction of Jesus. And you have Simon the Cyrene here, who's helping to carry Jesus carry his cross, but you also see Kenyan soldiers here who are often persecuting those in the church. You have children here standing by. And again, you have standing in the place of Roman soldiers, you have Kenyan soldiers. That again, that these stories that emerge from culture to speak to its culture about how Jesus is in solidarity with those who suffer. Again, stories emerging from culture to speak to its culture, to tell this story about who Jesus is and the various ways in which it's meant to be communicated. Jesus, again, isn't just one who suffers and generally suffers, but again, he suffers under the hands much like those who suffered under the rule of Kenyan dictators. And so redemption, that God doesn't canonize a culture, that there's nothing morally, culturally superior to Israelite culture, but rather Israelite culture is the vehicle through which God chose to communicate his message, to communicate his character and his will for humanity. So when we look through the Old Testament, we experience and we go through a cross-cultural endeavor, as you guys know well from your cultures class. That as you guys are reading through these cultures, that you guys are learning a ton about the way things work, like honor, shame. That you guys are seeing these challenges in the New Testament when these Pharisees are asking Jesus questions, that they're not curious. You're reading and seeing these challenges of what the Pharisees have and seeing some of the dynamics and how they enrich the text and how Jesus is just a grade A badass about how he just goes about continuing to respond to Pharisees and how he just keeps shutting them down. It's out of control. But because we have an understanding of what's going on within the culture, we can understand for ourselves and make sense of the stories, the ways in which God is communicating with his people. But redemption in and of itself, it's not primarily a theological term. And this is going to come as a surprise for some of you, that redemption is not primarily a theological term. It is a social term. It has sociological implications. It has implications on people. That to redeem something, someone, has everything to do with the laws and the social customs of an ancient society, of which the Hebrews are a part. That has everything to do, again, with the laws and the social customs. And we all have them. We all have them. But specifically for the Hebrew people, that they're patriarchal, patrilineal, and patrilocal. And you guys aren't going to have to memorize this, but it's definitely going to be good to know, especially as we take a look at these few stories that we're going to get into. So patriarchal. This has more to do with the centrality of the oldest living male member in relationship to the larger society. Again, patriarchy has more to do with the oldest living male in the family. And we'll go through a few stories of when this is more of a concern for us. Patrilineal, that traces the ancestral descent through the male line. Again, you'll see son of this person, son of this person, son of this person. So again, so think Matthew 1 in genealogy more specifically. And then patrilocal, that it's the pattern of marriage in which the couple settles in the husband's home or community. In my father's house, there are many rooms. This is really important, especially for our understanding of the New Testament. That when Jesus says he's going to go to prepare a place for us in the Father's house, it was a Hebrew Jewish custom for the male. That's why you see Joseph split for a while, because what the male was expected to do is that at the time of the engagement, they would be engaged for about a year. But during that time, the husband or I guess, the fiance, um, soon to be groom, would go away for about a year to build an addition to his parents' house. So when they do tie the knot, he would bring the wife home to the parents' house, which he had built on, again, in addition. So again, the male would go away for a year in order to build an addition onto the home. And then once they got married, he would bring her home to that addition, which belongs to the family's home, which again belonged to the father. And that the son, the oldest male son, usually would inherit the home and continue along the process, of that, of continuing to build on these additions. So again, when Jesus says that he's going to go to prepare a place for us, you have these notions of Jesus being the groom who's going to come back for his bride in order to bring the bride back into the Father's house, to belong to the household. And so, again, for the sake of time, we'll talk through some of these interpretations because we're supposed to have read these for today. But as we read through these various texts, are there anything that comes to mind in the story of Ruth? Thinking of Genesis 14, and that, just as a reminder, is the story of Abraham and Lot, and then thinking through the first three chapters of Hosea. What are some of the ways that you guys see redemption worked out, and what we're seeing here, that um, the oldest living member of a family, seeing how there's that male descent, and talking about that pattern of marriage in which, yeah, the husband goes and brings his wife home. Again, looking at those stories in Ruth, Genesis, and Hosea. And this is just kind of, again, kind of more off the cuff, but is there anything here that immediately comes to mind when you guys hear some of this stuff? And I'll go ahead and I'll go back so you guys can take a look at it. Again, thinking through Ruth, thinking through Genesis 14, thinking through Hosea chapters 1 through 3. Any initial thoughts as you guys are going through your reading? Kind of just, okay. Let me go ahead. Let me go ahead and do this really quickly then. There we go. Let me go ahead and open this up for you guys so you guys can take a look, see what I'm looking at. I always say that, but okay. All right. So keeping some of these ideas in mind, we're going to go ahead and read through the first, at least first paragraph of Ruth, and then we'll talk about the story that happens. So in the days when the judges ruled, great, we already got context here. There was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to live in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his two sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and his wife, and the name of his wife was Naomi. And the names of his two sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her two sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpah, and the other was named Ruth. When they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, so that the woman was left with her two sons, without her two sons and her husband. So just from these 5 verses, thinking through your cultures class, what's one of the issues that are presented here? And I'll go ahead and share this. Again, it's something that's cultural. What's one of the issues that is presented here? What's one of the issues for Ruth? It's one of the issues that people virtually see themselves when graduation gets closer and closer.
Like, who's
Especially
going
if
to
you're from-
be the heir to the, I guess, household?
Yeah,
The 2 sons?
yeah. But why does that question come up?
Because the husband is dead.
Who else is dead? Look at verse 5.
Oh, Melon and Chilon also died.
The sons are gone as
So
well.
she was left.
Good. And so, again, kind of serving as a reminder that to be a widow without sons at this point is virtually a death sentence, which is why, if you remember, if you could think over to Jesus's crucifixion, when Paulum, now 3 widows, therefore no patriarch. Exactly. That Jesus telling John that, behold your mother, and then Jesus telling his mom, hey, behold your son, essentially passing off what would be the responsibilities of the firstborn to take care of his mom off to John, because Jesus is about to go to die. That again, there's no, not only is there not there's not a patriarch, there's also not sons to step in the place of the patriarch in order to take care not only of the mom, but then also of the wives as well. So you got this mess of a situation. And so what Ruth presents us with is this image when Boaz comes into the picture of a redeemer. That redemption has to do with the patriarch rescuing a family member, because Boaz ends up, again, being a family member from family member's family member, family member, family member, and that it was the cultural responsibility of the family member that when there's no patriarch, to step into the place in order to take care of the widow. So again, for Ruth, who experiences these life-crippling circumstances, not only does she experience the death of her husband, of her father-in-law, her brother-in-law, also experiencing famine, at risk of dying of starvation, Ruth goes into a foreign land as a foreign woman. And so again, all these circumstances start to get piled up. And here you have Boaz, who comes in as this redeemer, acting in obligation to the cultural norms, which again, we would identify him in those terms as righteous or participating faithfully to his obligations. So what does Boaz do? Essentially, he goes in and he redeems her. He goes in and redeems her. He rescues her from crippling circumstances which would otherwise have left her not just miserable, but dead. He brings her into a family. He brings her into a home. He ensures life for her and for her kids and for, again, the generations after them, in order to make sure that she belonged to a family. And so let me go through another one. Genesis 14. And again, we'll keep these short. So in the days of King Amramphel, of Shinar, King Arioch, of Eleazar, King Shedalmar, of Elam, King Tidal of Goim, these kings made war with King Bera of Sodom, King Birsha of Gomorrah, King Shinab of Admah. You're gonna have a bunch of kings, Shedemar of Zeboim. All these joined in the forces of Valley of Siddim. 12 years they have served Chedorlaomer. In the 13th year, they rebelled. In the year 14th year, so you're going to have war happening here. I'm going to go down to verse 11 or verse 10. Now the valley of Siddim was full of bitumen pits, and as the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some fell into them, and the rest fell to the hill country, or fled to the hill country. So the enemy took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all the provisions and went their way. They also took Lot, the son of Abram's brother, who lived in Sodom, and his goods, and they departed. So what's one of the problems here, other than war? Whose name pops up? Mostly look at 11 and 12, verses 11 and 12.
Lot and Abram's brother.
What happens to him?
They they get taken, captured.
There you go. Abducted. Verse 13. Then one who had escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew, who was living by the oaks of Mamre and the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and Aner. These were allies of Abram. Then when Abram heard that his nephew had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men born in his house, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan to the north. He divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and routed them and pursued them to Hobah, north of Damascus. Then he brought back all the goods and also brought back his nephew Lot with his goods and the women and the people. And so here again, we see the ways in which redemption is worked out. Because what we don't know in the story is that Lot's dad had died. And so Lot is now under the care of Abraham. So Abraham has the obligation that what has happened to his nephew, because Abraham, again, is now in charge of him, he's now responsible for him, has to go out and rescue Lot from an enemy. That Abram, as the patriarch, was responsible to go out and rescue Lot from the hands of enemies. So what does Abraham do? He goes out and puts his own household on the line, his own life on the line, in order to rescue his nephew Lot and to bring him back into safety. And again, this is another expression of redemption in Israel's culture, that Abraham, as the patriarch, has the responsibility to put his own life on the line in order to bring family members home. And hopefully you guys are kind of getting the idea that this is starting to sound a lot like gospel. And so I won't go through the story because, again, it's 3 chapters long. But you have Hosea, who is a prophet. God tells him to go and marry Gomer, who is a prostitute. And this relationship of Hosea, who's the faithful prophet, and Gomer, who's the unfaithful prostitute, is reflective and descriptive of God's relationship with his own people. And so what Hosea goes out and does every time Gomer gets taken into captivity, into slavery, which is probably closer to sex trafficking, that what he does, he goes and buys back his wife, the mother of his children, as she's about to go into slavery. And this is what's called redemption. That Hosea goes out and he purchases, he pays to get Gomer, despite her unfaithfulness, out of slavery to bring her back into his home. And this is likewise called redemption. And so again, that in Israel's tribal society, redemption is the act of a patriarch who puts his own resources on the line to rescue, to ransom a family member who had been driven to the margins of society by poverty, who had been seized by an army against whom he had no defense, and who found themselves enslaved by the consequences of a faithless or unfaithful life. So let me now ask you, friends, does this bring up any ideas about what God has done in Jesus? Using these kinds of resources, this kind of language, how do you guys see what God has done in Jesus in your guys' readings, in lectures, on assignments?
He's put himself on the line and risked his own household for an unfaithful, almost prostitute-like people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What's he rescued him from?
Kind of themselves and sin.
Yeah.
Separation.
Yep, definitely.
Everything that's good.
Yeah. And what else?
Giving them a family, purpose.
Yeah. Yep. And what's that family called?
The body, Christ.
Yep. Exactly. Exactly. Anybody else? Yeah, exactly. And the things you described, Dominic, it's just it's multi-layered from the things that there's not just one thing that what Jesus does to bring us in to redeem us. That redemption is the means in which a lost family member is restored to a place of security within the kinship circle of being brought back into the family, being brought back into God's family. And relating it to the gospel narrative of what Jesus has done, that there's a few passages more specifically. Colossians 1, that he's rescued us from the power of darkness and transferred us into the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. That again, you're not redeemed, you're part of God's family just for you to get to heaven and hopefully you make it to the other side, but rather you're rescued out of darkness, you're taken out of sin, from the power of sin, to not be a slave to it, but in order to be a servant of Jesus, to be brought into the family of God. To not be an orphan in the world, but rather to be in the community, the kingdom of Jesus, and belonging to this family called the church. And yes, it is a messy, messy family that gets a lot of things wrong. But the point is that when we pursue and love Jesus and one another, that we experience the love and grace of Jesus that sustains us and carries us, not just to the from here to heaven, but from the day to day. And what makes it so essential and so important, and I'm going to keep on hammering this nail on the same head over and over again, is that that's what makes it so essential about being in community with one another and addressing these kinds of things, because these are not just optional. Hopefully we get it right every once in a while. These aren't just, community isn't luxury. That community is essential. Why? Because this is the family that we belong to. And I know that's problematic because a lot of you are in the same positions as me, that come from broken families with lots and lots of issues. Where the holidays, a lot of people it's time for celebrations, but for a lot of us, it comes with a lot of anxiety, because of the traumas we've experienced in the past, because of loss we've experienced in the past, because of the reminders that we have that that our families have issues, that we have issues. And so this concept of family for a lot of us, it's not a comforting one, myself included. But that is part of the reality that God has given to us as a gift. Is that, yeah, we're not going to get this thing perfect. And for a lot of our churches, tragically, that we just don't experience a lot of the beauty of family that God's provided. That to be able to grieve with one another, to be honest with one another, to be able to be loved and cared for by another individual with no strings attached. But and that's part of the family, the community that God's provided. And I talk about it in idealistic terms in order not to necessarily communicate the reality, because that's not the reality a lot of times, but to say about the way things ought to be and help motivate us about the kinds of people we ought to be ourselves, even if we don't always experience that reality. And so again, I have to check myself, if not every day, every hour, every other hour, about the kind of person, and that am I reflecting the love, the grace, the generosity of Jesus, or am I so controlled by my own selfishness, self-interests, that I stop to care for people? And having experienced a massive failure just, I think, like 2 days ago, it wasn't anything moral. It wasn't cheating on my wife. It wasn't stealing a bunch of money from church, but more so, I had experienced an anxiety attack that I just, I couldn't get myself out of it. And having learned some of the tools to get myself out of those kinds of situations, that I didn't do the best job. And so what I did is that the next day, finally, we got to sleep, and I woke up the next morning and apologized to my wife about what had happened, and just I didn't defend it, didn't try to reason it away. And I'm already going to counseling, so I could identify some of the things that had happened, but that knowing that I had missed it. And thankfully, my wife has the grace and the patience enough to be able to not just forgive me, but to want to continue to work on that stuff with me, because again, that knowing that we're both works in progress. And so I don't say that as much as it is that everything is nice and pretty and happy, like it has a happy ending, because it's, again, we're still going through it and trying to work some of these things out. But there was a moment of sobriety when I had realized that there's room for improvement here. There's room for improvement here. And I would dare to say and dare to challenge and encourage you guys that there's room for improvement. And not to say that everything's going to get better by tomorrow, but I would dare to say that we can be more loving friends, more loving brothers and sisters, more loving neighbors, even if just by a little bit. Even if just by a little bit. And especially during a time like we're in right now, when people are desperately needing and to experience a different just kind of love and grace and honesty. And so, one last thing. 1 Peter 1, that you know that you were ransomed from the futile ways inherited from your ancestors, not with perishable things like gold, like silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without defect or blemish. And I had brought up how in Peter, that the context for this are people that have very little, both in terms of community and property and possessions. But yet what they have has been bought, not with silver and gold, not with dollars and cents, not with Gucci and Versace, but with the precious blood of Jesus. That we've been ransomed. that the price paid for your belonging to a family is not of monetary worth, but of eternal worth, and that of the blood of Jesus, God's only Son. It wasn't like he had a bunch of extras and decided to give one up. But the only Son God had, which was given up for every one of us, given up for you in order for you to be brought into a family. That we're worth more than we know. That you're worth more than you know. And so may we just prayerfully consider and ask God that if you're really struggling with worth right now, that you would ask God, show me. Help me to know, to experience the kind of worth that I'm reading in this text, especially if you're coming from broken, abusive homes, broken, abusive relationships, and traumas that have happened to you in the past that have said otherwise. Then this is something for you to grapple with and to receive for yourself of how much worth you are. That there's a text in Romans when Paul says that rarely for a good person will someone die. And that Paul's pulling on some of the understandings about the self-giving of friendship, pulling on some Greco-Roman themes. And that the absurdity of somebody to give their life for the sake of another person, but yet to see the beauty of that absurdity. And that in Jesus giving his own life for us, and especially as we're looking at Advent, and we're in the time of Advent, we're looking for hope, looking forward to the time when Jesus comes again in anxious anticipation, coming back to redeem us, to bring us to himself in its totality and its fullness. That we're people that continue to long and hope and wait. And part of that waiting and that hoping comes with a kind of suffering, but we don't suffer without hope. Again, knowing that our lives are of immeasurable worth, because if we could put a price tag to Jesus' own life, then maybe we have an idea. And so again, that this is what it means to be redeemed. The whole story of God bringing his people back to himself despite themselves, despite their own failures, their hang-ups, their unwillingness to follow, and how God so gives of himself to bring them back to himself. That's why we want to know the story, in order to help both ourselves and for other people to know what's the reality of what's occurred in bringing people back home to Jesus, for them to have a family to belong to have an inheritance, to have a place for so many that lack a place to belong. And that's why we need to know the story of what's happened for them. What's God's character? What's his nature like? That in times of suffering and difficulty, where can we turn to? What do we know? What can we know? Because the reality of the situations around us are telling us that believing in God's of no use, of little benefit to us. But what has God done? And what hope can we cling to in order to continue to help us press along this journey? And brothers and sisters, I tell you guys right now, this is the Bible. It's the Bible. That we get these stories in our bones in order for ourselves to become acquainted not just with the words of the text, but with the person that the text is trying to point us towards, which is Jesus. So are there any questions, comments, concerns? Before we pass around the offering bucket, you guys could just drop it in my Venmo. Oh, come on, Faith. All I could get is a LOL. I know you're not laughing out loud. That's what you just, that's the pity one. That's the pity giggle. All right. Well, if there's no other questions, comments, concerns, thoughts, things you want me to put you on blast for, what's the Venmo? I was going to you later, Vladimir. All right. Yeah, if you guys have any questions, comments, I'll be around here for a little while. Yeah, and really that's the semester. That's a semester. Again, we'll meet up next Monday at 1 o'clock. The Zoom the Zoom link is going to be the same. Again, next Thursday, your guys' any late work, your guys' storyboard projects, all due next Thursday. If you guys have any more questions about that, please email me. I'll be responding to emails if you've already emailed me about it over the weekend. Again, the weekend was nuts, so give your boy some grace, and we'll all answer those emails right after class. And so, thank you. Appreciate you guys. Thank you. I appreciate that. So yeah, if you guys don't have any questions, you guys are feel free to go. Enjoy your guys' afternoon. I don't know who's playing football tonight. That's kind of been the last of the concerns, but yeah, let's go Barca. That was a good week last week. So, all right.